So welcome to Friday Night at Cary. I'm Bill Schlesinger. It's great to have this crowd here tonight to hear one of our senior scientific staff, Steward Pickett, who's been with the Cary Institute since 1986. Steward hails out of Kentucky and went to the University of Kentucky for his undergraduate degree, then on to the University of Illinois where he worked with the factory pizzazz and studied plant succession, the orderly replacement of plants once you abandon land, and weeds are followed by shrubs, followed by trees, and the argument of the process that determines that has been one of the long-standing arguments and controversies in ecology. From there, Steward went to Rutgers University and worked his way up through various ranks, and then this must be just one of the greatest scandals. He came here to be a visiting professor for a year or so, visiting scientist, and lo and behold, at the end of that year, he became a member of the scientific staff here, and worked his way up through the various ranks here to distinguished senior scientist at the Cary Institute. Along the way, Steward not only has made a name for himself in studies of plant succession, this orderly process of one plant species replacing another as ecosystems recover from disturbance, but he realized that spatial patterns and spatial, what we call heterogeneity, were very strong influences on that process, that you really couldn't understand the way plants might replace each other in succession without understanding the patchiness of soils and the patchiness of plant competition that went along with that. And one thing led to another, and Steward found himself looking at urban areas and the recovery of some of those urban lands from disturbance, sometimes extreme disturbance, and that the spatial pattern of heterogeneity made a big difference there. And with that, Steward proposed, and his project was accepted as the long-term ecological or ecosystem studies project in Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore LTER, as we call it, is one of the two studies that have focused on urban ecosystems in the U.S. The other one is in Phoenix. But Steward shepherded that project from conception to funding. It's been through a couple of rounds of funding. They just had a midterm review of their third round of funding, I think it is. And it has been a landmark project of how to look at cities as ecological systems. You know, we're sort of all used to as ecologists thinking, well, what do we do? Well, we go out and find the most pristine natural area and try to study that and what goes on in it. But a huge proportion of the human population lives in cities, and a huge proportion of the land surface is increasingly impacted with urbanization type development. And the urban LTER attempts to make an assessment of what that means for the landscape, what that means for biodiversity, what it means for water and nitrogen, energy, the kinds of things that keep society running. And as I said, the Cary Institute is really proud that the Baltimore LTER, one of the two in the country, is centered here, largely as a result of Steward's activities. And we asked him tonight, he asked me sort of, what do you want to talk about? And I said, talk about whatever you want to with urban ecosystems. Our audience, our likely audience tonight, probably hasn't thought about urban ecosystems much, but they've heard that Cary is a center of that. So the floor is yours. It's entitled Cities in Crisis, Ecology and Urban Transformations. Steward Pickett.
Have I successfully turned on the microphone? Yes. All right. Now I have to successfully close one program. All right. Do I need to speak up?
Yes.
All right. I will do that. I first need to concentrate on getting this going. Well, I'm delighted to be here with you tonight. I'm a cheap date. I'm going to take you through some stories of city transformation, and I'm going to use the city that I know most about, which is Baltimore, Maryland. And I'm going to lead that story up to pointing to a moment of crisis, which is actually a shared kind of crisis in urban areas around the world. It's not, this is a story that starts to be about Baltimore, but it really goes much beyond that. And then I'm going to talk about how ecology might fit into the transformations that would follow on from this crisis point. You all have been told to turn off your cell phones, and I am turning mine on so that it rings at an appropriate time in the future. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the ecological thinking about urban transformations helps us to envision and to move towards sustainability in the urban realm. Now, I'm doing a couple of things different tonight. One is that I'm not really going to present data. Data is behind what I'm saying, but I'm not going to present you any data, so you can relax. But the other thing that I'm going to do different is I'm going to use Prezi, which is a new kind of technology for me. This is actually the fourth Prezi that I've done. The first one that I presented, the computer ate the one that I was going to present at Harvard a few weeks ago, and the others were just finger exercises. So hopefully this one will be, we'll see what this one is, but new technology. So I'm going to tell you the Baltimore story as a way to get into the transformations of urban systems. And this is a new thing. It's really kind of cool. You really can feel it. So I might start dancing. So Baltimore starts out as a mercantile city, a really small settlement on the sheltered banks of the harbor of the Chesapeake Bay, where commodities were brought and traded. So that's really the start of many, many cities in the United States, elsewhere as well. So Baltimore starts out as such a trading city. But then it transforms into an industrial city. And why am I showing you a church window to illustrate an industrial city? This is the industry window at the Zion Lutheran Church in Baltimore. So Baltimore was so industrial that they even enshrined it in churches. And I thought that was a pretty cool thing. And this is a detail of that window showing the belching iron that became Bethlehem steel at Sparrows Point, for example. But the industrial city had problems. There were many things that were great about the industrial city. Baltimore really did become an industrial powerhouse, and it added that onto its mercantile prowess. And for example, there's a neighborhood in Baltimore called Canton, which is named for the fact that the Baltimore Clippers made short work of moving things back and forth globally. But the industrial city was also a dangerous and a hazardous place. This is the outline of the city of Baltimore in 1880. It's a little bit smaller than the city itself is now. The dark blue is the highland. The lighter colors are the lands right near the harbor. And what you see here is these red dots are infant mortalities in the year 1880. 25% rather, of the children born in 1880 died before their first birthday of waterborne diseases. That's one of the downsides of the industrial city. Think Dickens. So now, as a result of that, people, either in political situations, community situations, worked to make the industrial city a less dangerous place while maintaining its profitability and its other amenities. And Baltimore transformed then into a sanitary city. Now, this happened relatively late in Baltimore compared to many U.S. cities. For example, I think New York, you could say, New York City began to be a sanitary city in the middle of the 19th century. Baltimore didn't install the sanitary sewer system until 1911, and that's because of a different political situation in Maryland relative to, they didn't let Baltimore raise its own money, so Baltimore really couldn't do very much without that authority. And in the early 1900s, in 1904, there was a fire in Baltimore that burned most of the downtown, burned for about a day, and was ultimately put out because the wind changed and it ran up against a creek. And that was the impetus for the state to say, maybe we ought to let them float a bond because they kind of need to rebuild. And that was what allowed Baltimore then to start to become a sanitary city. This is actually the installation of some of the trunk sewers in Baltimore in the early 1900s. Now, these guys are all wearing hats and whatnot. This is a storm sewer, a storm drain, which is also part of the sanitary sewer. Get the storm water, get the rainwater off the streets, out of the basements, off the foundations. This is a map of the infrastructure, water pipes, gas pipes, electric conduit, at the intersection of Gay and Lombard Street in Baltimore, near City Hall. Remember that intersection, Gay and Lombard Street. There will be a quiz. This is the pumping station built to move the sewage around. Now, back in the early days of the sanitary city, what you did was you took the stuff you didn't want in the city and you got it out of the city as fast as you could. You made tall smokestacks, or you put pipes out in the harbor. You didn't treat it, you just got rid of it. And that made your city locally sanitary, but it sort of wrecked the rest of the environment. And that's a time when, say, you stop having great oyster harvest in Baltimore. This story, I'm telling you a Baltimore story, but this story is the same story that you can find in New York City, say Jamaica Bay being the seafood basket, okay, that's bad, of New York, and just being so badly polluted in the 19th century that it couldn't perform that function anymore. Poughkeepsie, for example, an industrial city, once the biggest beer-making city in America. What else did it make? Barrels for the beer. Bricks, there are about 50 brick-making factories in Poughkeepsie. This is a common story in our northern hemisphere cities. Another attribute of sanitary cities is the addition of some large-scale amenities. And this shows some big parks. The dark green areas are big parks designed by the Olmsted brothers in 1904. The whole plan wasn't realized, but this was a part of the sanitary city to give people a retreat, to give people a little bit of nature in the city that could compensate for the ills of the social ills and the psychological ills of this industrial city becoming a sanitary city. And this was all done on the public purse, all done with top-down management, civil departments, city departments, with professional schools feeding the technocrats. That's how it was done. And that was a great invention. That was a great invention. It took about 100 years to put it in place. But what about ecology? The professions that were involved in that top-down sanitary city approach were engineering and architecture, mainly, various kinds of engineering and architecture. And ecology just wasn't part of the mix. Well, ecology as a science didn't exist then. Ecology was only coming to be in the early 1900s. So here's a picture of some row house development in Baltimore. This is really quite close to downtown now. Here's the Jones Falls going under the bridge here, Maryland Avenue. So you just sort of rolled over it. And Baltimore's famous row house architecture just rolls out a grid. Actually, it rolls out about 5 grids because it's fitting the harbor and different rivers, different streams. Just rolls over the ecology. This is the stream map, the surface stream map of Baltimore in 1939, I believe. And this is in 1990. All right? Ecology as a visible part of the city is hidden, it's rolled over, it's replaced by things like this. This is a stream, a buried stream. Some people call it a storm sewer. It's a buried stream. Now, some animals adapt. Some animals come with people. There's a suite of animals that are common in urban areas throughout the world. This one is a local animal for the east. And they're actually adapting pretty well to cities. You see them much more commonly in cities now. So there are parts of ecological processes that even though there was this attempt to roll over it bury it, exclude it, isolate it in these parks as little social amenities, there's still ecology in the city. And that's one of the things that our Baltimore ecosystem study has really demonstrated quite nicely. And really, Bill was very kind in giving me so much credit for the Baltimore ecosystem study, but the Baltimore ecosystem study is a collaboration of about 5 of the scientific staff here at the Carey Institute, plus a whole gang of other people elsewhere. And so, let's see, Peter is there, Peter Groffman, Emma Rossi Marshall, Alan Berkowitz, who else am I not seeing? Oh, Shannon, okay, Shannon Ledoux, right? So that's everybody who's here. And it's a team, and I'm representing a lot of work that other people have done. I'm not going to take the time to credit it all, because I don't have that much time with you tonight. But one of the things that we have found is that there really is, even in the city as currently functioning, a lot of ecological function. And people just ignore this ecological work being done by the city. And that's symbolized here by this little turf grass cut. Our folks have discovered that, say, for the important work, just to give you a concrete example, of transforming nitrate, which is a nasty groundwater pollutant, transforming nitrate into forms that do not pollute groundwater, into forms of nitrogen that do not pollute groundwater. A lot of that work still goes on in the green spaces in the city, in the parks, in the yards, in the wastelands, in the derelict lots. So, ecology is still happening in the sanitary city, but it's not being used. It's not being exploited. All right, now the sanitary city is a city in crisis. New York, 150 years of sanitary city. Baltimore, about 100 years of being a sanitary city. The stuff is beginning to break. A water main break at the intersection of Gay and Lombard Street. A sanitary city blow, or sanitary sewer blowout. We don't need to look at that more. These are the bottom steps of the famous marble stoops of a row of houses in Baltimore. And this is one of the most poignant pictures that I own. I was down helping Mary Cat Nasso lead one of her classes from Yale in urban ecology when she was there. And we were, here's this bunch of clueless Yale kids, me and Mary, who've known Baltimore, wandering around, and we're trying to keep them out of trouble. But we were walking down this block talking about the ecology of the city, and this gentleman walks up to us and says, "Hey, what's up?" And one of the costs of doing urban ecological research is you've got to be ready to stop and talk to people. And so we did. And this guy started pointing out where his grandmother's house had been, where his aunt's house had been, and whatnot. He told a whole story of this vacant neighborhood. Baltimore, as so many of our post-industrial cities, has lost roughly half its population. Some have lost more. And so there's thinning in the city, which is potentially, as I'll say in a minute, there's some potential that you can get from that. But there's also great social and economic costs to that thinning. All of our cities are becoming thinner in the center, with certain exceptions, less than 175 miles north and south of there. Thinner in the city, denser on the edges. So they're kind of becoming flatter and broader. Here's an abandoned factory. This happens to be an old printing press, printer shop, a lithographer shop. This one also is poignant. You can take a lot of poignant pictures in Baltimore. The printer's device, their symbol, is worked here in stone. And the motto in Latin is Saxa Loquuntur, or something like that. Anybody know what that means? The stones are speaking to you. Heat Island is one of the one of the parts of the crisis of cities, and with climate change, and this reminds me to mention climate change is part of the crisis that so many of our cities are experiencing now. Cities generally are hotter than non-cities because of the asphalt, because of the massive masonry aspects of buildings. The trees, the cool colors, are cooler temperatures. And you see that the building surfaces and the streets are hot. These are re-radiating. These are re-radiating. So by and large, you can get temperatures at night in cities in the east, say, that are 5 to 10, even more sometimes, degrees hotter than the surroundings. And in a heat wave, that can be a real public health disaster, as has been documented more times than people seem to remember. This is another part of our urban crisis, the dependence on individual transportation, the consuming of agricultural and wild lands near cities, or sometimes even far away from cities. This kind of phenomenon is one of the big issues for land management in the United States today. Think the pictures that you've seen on the news of firefighters valiantly trying to save a house that's built in a forest that has a 1,000-year history of burning. And so the interaction of suburban development with different kinds of lands, the removal of resources from old core cities to new suburbs, there are all sorts of issues that are associated with that. So we have a variety of kinds of crises. Now this comes from a really neat little thing that you can find on the New York Times website, and I think the title is something like What Might Be Lost. And what it does is to take just sea level and says, what would it look like, what does it look like now, what would it look like with a 5% increase in sea level, or 5%, the rate, I'm not getting that right, sorry, I apologize. But it's something like, this is showing you Baltimore with about a 10-foot rise in sea level. Not much. Baltimore doesn't lose much with just sea level. What happens where the crisis really works out is in storms where the elevated sea level now is the base on which the storm surge exists. And we've already seen in the last decade people kayaking on Pratt Street or doing water biking in Fells Point. So the base sea level isn't necessarily the big issue in Baltimore, but the storm surges that are added on it. And this is a phenomenon that is common in coastal cities. And guess what? Where are most cities? They're coastal. They're coastal. Most cities in the world are in deltas or on coasts. And most of the rest of them are on rivers. And then there are a few like Atlanta that are just where rail lines happen to cross. And that, we won't say anything more about Atlanta, will we? Now, another thing here, I'm showing you City Hall again, but part of the crisis that the sanitary city is experiencing now is the shrinking role of formal government and the shrinking resources of formal government. It just means that now, for example, in Baltimore, you have an infrastructure that's built for 1.2 million people, and it's now being supported by 620-some thousand people. So it's a mismatch in the resource and the support. But all of this leads to an opportunity. So I'm not at the end of the talk talking about just crisis, so relax. This points us to opportunity. All right, so now how can we fold ecological thinking and our understanding of ecological processes into this ongoing urban transformation that the entire globe is experiencing? And the first point here is to confirm that this is a global phenomenon. This is a bizarre map. I was at MIT a year ago on sabbatical and encountered this map there, and they allowed me to use it. This is North America and South America. The dark circles represent the proportion of the population that was urban in 1950, and then the outer part is what's projected in the future, well, 2010. And so the darker colors represent cities that were denser longer ago. The lighter colors represent urbanization that is now occurring. So what you see is that the greatest change in urbanization, 1950 to 2010, is not in Europe. Here's Europe over here. Not so much in North America. There's a fair amount of urban change in Latin America, even though Latin America is already highly urbanized. And of course, the mass of urbanization is in China and India. But the greatest proportional change in urbanization is in Africa. All right? The world is changing, and the kinds of cities that I've shown you a story for in Baltimore, mercantile, industrial, sanitary, this kind of life cycle, this kind of succession of cities, is not what you're getting in so much of the rest of the world now. So we're going to have to think about cities differently. People designing these cities have an opportunity to think differently about how to fold ecology into the benefits that those cities provide. Here's a brownfield in Baltimore. This is near the shore. It's an old factory site. And there's an opportunity now to reclaim some of these lands to allow ecological work to go on in them. And when I say ecological work, I mean things that benefit people as well as things that benefit birds and foxes. But we have an opportunity with the thinning of our cities to reconfigure the open space in cities, not just to confine it to the big parks that are in the stream valleys, which is where most of Baltimore parks are. And why is that? Because they were on steep slopes, and so they weren't so great to build on in the first place. Geez, that was generous. But we have the opportunity to have open space, to have functional ecological processes spread throughout the city. And don't neglect the little slivers of land. It doesn't necessarily have to be big. Some of our design colleagues have looked at ways to think about water management. Water is a problem in all cities. Either you don't have enough or you have too much. Water management, surface water management, is a problem in cities throughout. So what Brian McGrath did, this stands for best management practices for surface water management. And there are strategies that are entirely vegetated and strategies that are entirely non-vegetated or mostly engineered. And then there's a mix of vegetated and engineered. And he says, well, look, I've looked at all of these things, and you can classify them based on how they engage with the root tops and downspouts, how they engage filtration of the water, how they retain water, slow down the movement of water before it gets into the drainage network, either your pipes or your streams. And I don't need to go through all of the details here, but just to be aware that there are a lot of different things that you can do. Some are mixed of green and gray, if you will, ecological and engineered. Some are one or the other. And so we have an opportunity to reconfigure our surface water management in cities. Sustainability plans are a big part of how cities are beginning to take advantage of the crisis moment that we're in. And this is the website, this is the front page of the Baltimore City Sustainability website. And I will read these 7 items. Cleanliness, pollution prevention, resource conservation, greening, transportation, education and awareness, and green economy. And I'm happy to say that the Baltimore Ecosystem Study actually is engaged with the Office of Sustainability in Baltimore City and the equivalent office in Baltimore County, and we're working with some of the other counties to try to be helpful with these things, to help them understand what these things mean, how they can measure them, how they can assess how well they're doing from an ecological perspective. And you see things like stormwater management being retrofit into the city. This is a rain garden with, there's actually a catchment basin under here that collects the water and slowly lets it infiltrate. This is a plan done by some of the students of Brian McGrath at Parsons. That's the main studio with which we work for dealing with ecological design. And you see this is several blocks in West Baltimore. This is the ill-fated, originally intended to be Interstate 70. There's an interesting history there. But this is this is several blocks of almost entirely vacant land. Row houses just gone. People moved out starting in the 60s. And there are plans here for urban farming. And the Baltimore Office of Sustainability actually is using urban farming as an active strategy to engage communities and to get some value in these vacant parcels. There are a lot of other properties that can be used for tree corridors. These interior parks, these are little alley-bound parcels that can be thread together to generate, say, corridors of forests in the city. This shows some work of one of our colleagues, Lena Irwin, and I will give her credit here because this is well, all of it's cool, but this is 3 counties north of Baltimore, and here's Baltimore City. And the different colors here show you different sizes of subdivision, and the moral of the story is here that smaller subdivisions are easier to get approved, and so there are more smaller subdivisions. So people choose to do smaller ones, which means the landscape now becomes more fragmented. So there's an opportunity here to be aware of the unintended effects of certain regulations and figure out how to improve the continuous connections of green space or agricultural space in our whole urban mosaic. Okay, so we've got an opportunity. We see some moves towards sustainability. How do you, as an institution, as a city, as a person, what do you do about this? How do you choose sustainability? So I'm giving Baltimore examples, but again, this is something that applies to all kinds of cities. The old cities of the Northeast, the relatively newer cities of the South and Southwest, the just add water cities in China, and urbanization in this odd urbanization that we have in Africa, where people are neither urban nor rural. They're both, depending on what month you catch them. All right, so let's look at this. Sustainability really reminds us that when we plan for the future, when we try to improve the current condition, we're doing so with the recognition that key are 3 things: a viable natural environment, nurturing social communities, and economies sufficient to support people's livelihoods. And this shows some intermediate areas, and hopefully when you work on sustainability, you're integrating all 3 of those. Ecology is the one that is often left out. People talk about all 3, and then they move on, and it's just economy, or maybe it's just environmental justice. And those things are really important, but alone, they're not going to do it. Or even together, they're not going to do it. It really will take 3. And one of the reasons that this is so important is that cities change, urban areas change in all of these dimensions. And all of these things that I've told you about this Baltimore story affect each of these things: social, environmental, and economic. Now, sustainability is not a scientific concept. Sustainability is a set of social goals that a community, a city, a jurisdiction gets together and they negotiate. And it's normative. It says, this is how we think it should be. So this is a social goal that society, however you conceive it, figures out. Now, behind that, or beneath it, is this thing which is a scientific concept and a mechanism, and that is resilience or adaptation. Now, resilience refers to the capacity of a system to absorb changes and still maintain its rough identity. All right? In other words, you think about it like evolution. It's the capacity of a system to adapt, to not be made extinct. Pretty simple. It doesn't have any value. There are a lot of things that are resilient that are not very good. And there's some things that are resilient that are really precious and neglected. But resilience itself is just a mechanism. It just tells you that systems go through cycles of disruption and change and adjustment. And that's all this funny loop does. It says that all systems can accumulate resources. This comes from my familiarity with succession. That's one reason I like this. So through time, a system starting, say, these agricultural, post-agricultural fields, they accumulate the free resources into the biological part of the system. That's what this refers to, resource accumulation. Through time also, the system, the elements of the system, the members of the community, the plants, the animals, the soil microbes, and the physical environment becomes more interactive. There is greater connectivity, and that shows up on this axis. So you see an early successional or pioneer community exploits free resources, and then as the resources accumulate, the community becomes more connected, the functions become more conservative. All right? Now, if there's a disruption, either from outside, some sort of physical disturbance, or an internal disruption, and you think about internal disruptions in social ecological systems being things like riots and wars and economic shocks, that often releases resources, but then the trick is, can there be a structure or structures that reorganize, that take advantage of those released resources? Structures that take advantage of free resources, whether they're species or institutions, are built differently than the structures that can husband conserved resources. They're different adaptive structures. So the trick is your system, is your city, is your urban region capable of going all the way around this loop? Now and there's no time dimension up here. It does happen in time. It can be fast, it can be slow. There's some social scientists who've done, some anthropologists who've done a really nice job taking this and showing how this applies to the early civilizations, the early urban civilizations in Mesopotamia. It's pretty cool. So this thing works for social ecological systems. The mechanism of resilience, the thing that you need to remember is that what we need to be building in to become sustainable is adaptive capacity. The ability of our systems to undergo these shocks, but then to adapt. Now, one of the things I have to point out to you, since we're a year off of Sandy, in ecology we say there are two kinds of resilience, or in this sort of theoretical realm, there are two kinds of resilience. There's engineering resilience, which is the capacity to come back to some fixed state. And that's great if you're building an airplane or a bridge. It's got one function, and you know when it's not doing it. All right? And that's actually how people learned how to build bridges initially. How they learned how to build cathedrals. Engineering resilience. Now, for systems that have multiple functions and don't have a fixed final state, I mean, what's the fixed final state for a city? There is no fixed final state for a city. So you have to be much more aware of resilience as adaptation. Now there's a third kind. So that we call ecological or evolutionary resilience. And I hate to say that in the political realm, I'm going to get in trouble. In the political realm, the third kind of resilience is relax, we'll fix it, we'll build it back. And you've heard this phrase, build it back better. That's an engineering approach. And it's assuming, it's making certain assumptions about the kinds of threats that you have weathered in the past and those which will come down the pipe in the future. And we're not good at dealing with that. People are not good at dealing with that. Well, all of this leads to some new ways of thinking about cities. And I was, when Lori was telling me about how to do this, it was really great to get advice. Don't give a geeky science talk. She said, and also don't just leave them weeping. So, but there's some cool opportunities here that I've shown you so far, but intellectually there's some cool things here as well. New ways to think about cities. It's not urban versus rural. We have this intense history in Western society, I can't speak for others, of thinking about the city versus the countryside. The United States has the Jeffersonian ideal. Thomas Jefferson, who had many great qualities, hated cities. And he thought that the land ought to be divided up into parcels that individuals could farm and support themselves out in the country. And so he bought all this land from France, and he sent people out with surveying instruments and turned it into chunks, square chunks that could be sold or given away. And so the emphasis was get away from the city. And that's part of our urban versus rural problem in the United States. We have some other urban versus rural problems in the United States. Urban is used as a marketing label. It's used, there's some other social uses of urban which I will not go into. But here's a gradient from natural zones to rural zones. So you see there's not, so the gray things are buildings. And you see the streets or roads here. So you see an intensity of building and an intensity of pavement on this gradient. And that's kind of a standard way that people think about urban and rural, but they still separate. And really what we might be better doing is thinking about how these really are interacting with each other, how they're integrated. And there's a whole range of new scholarship that's emphasizing this, and that's going to help us as ecologists. Actually, it's going to make more problems for us, but that's okay. Scientists love new problems, right? So it keeps us, it gets you out of bed in the morning. Now this shows you urban megaregions. This is a projection from the, you can't read that, so why am I pointing at it? The Regional Plan Association from New York City, which was originally established as a planning body to help 3 states and 31 counties, and more turf than you can imagine, think rationally about its regional plan. Okay. And one of the things they've done is to say, what's the shape of urbanization in the future going to be? Well, in the United States, we've long recognized that from about Richmond to Portland, Maine, is a single conurbation. It's in the 50s, but actually in 1961, when the idea was proposed by a Frenchman of all people, but we have a history in this country of being observed by the French. Jean Gottman said that, look, this is really a series of cities that are strung together by rail lines, they're industrial centers, they communicate, they're really part of the same sort of social, economic system. And the same is true today, but what's happened actually is that we now have other mega regions. I mean, Atlanta wasn't, in 1950, what was Atlanta? What's Atlanta now? Well, so you've got a mega region developing here, you've got a mega region in Florida, the Gulf Coast, this Texas, Houston, and Dallas, and Houston's part of 2 mega regions. You have Arizona, Phoenix, and Tempe, and some of that goes into Mexico. You have the Front Range. You have Southern California and Northern California, which everybody out there loves to talk about as though there are 2 different states. And then you have the Pacific Northwest. These are all urban areas that are no longer in isolated cities with a few suburbs around them. They are this sort of smear, mix of what has traditionally been urban, traditionally suburban. People live out in the woods. That's what these firefighters are having problems with now. These are not cities versus the wild, they're cities versus the rural anymore. It's a different thing. It's a new kind of beast. But we still have the old words that we have to use. City. What does that mean now? I've been using that word without telling you what I meant. I have to mean something like this. And this is global. This is the famous composite from NASA of the lights of the Earth at night. Of course, the reason you know the reason it's composite. But anyway, if this were a real picture, we'd really be toast. But you see that they're all over the world. You have these sort of mega regions, these urban mega regions. Now, these urban mega regions are held together by a variety of kinds of dimensions. I'm identifying for livelihood, how people support themselves. And I have a picture of a factory up here, but people support themselves by growing stuff in their backyard, by trading things, by doing all kinds of work. It's how people support themselves, whether it's in a formal economy or not. Lifestyle, how do people associate? How do people identify themselves? What kinds of social symbols do they engage in? What kinds of purchases do they make to reify or to represent their social identity? That's what lifestyle deals with. And then we have distant connections, or what some scientists call teleconnections. This is a really fascinating one. For example, as people in China become more middle class and adopt middle class lifestyles, they eat more meat, statistically. And that meat, some of it comes from China, some of it comes from the United States, some of it comes from newly minted, newly cleared pig land in Australia. Cut down the forest, grow pigs, send them to China, everybody's happy. Except the fruit bats who used to live in the forest, who now move to the city where they become a problem. So, and part of the reason that they become a problem in the Australian cities is because the lifestyle choices of how Australians try to make their cities look like England. Whoa! So I look at all this, it's kind of, not only is it complex and unified or linked in any one country or any one region, we've got these crazy global connections, teleconnections going. And then the last category is place. And that is a term that social scientists might use. I might call it the local human ecosystem, recognizing that there are physical characteristics, there are biological characteristics, there are climate characteristics of a place, however you scale it. And those things mediate these other aspects, livelihood and lifestyle, and they participate and are affected by the distant connections. So these are the dimensions of these mega regions, whether we're talking within a continent or over the whole globe. Actions? All right. What can we as individuals do about this? A lot of our zoning is designed on the idea of the sanitary city. You identify a problem and you segregate it. You keep commercial and industrial separate from residential. That is not helpful for the sustainable city. Mixed use is a much more useful option to have on the table. If your regulations don't allow you to even think about mixed use, you're going to have a harder time moving towards sustainability. Building codes. Baltimore row houses make perfect sense when you have people have to walk to factories. They don't make such perfect sense when you don't have that. They also make perfect sense when you're completely freaked out because in 1904 you lost most of your downtown to a big fire. So you say the brick wall, the party walls have to remain inviolate. Baltimore row houses are in the working class neighborhoods an average of 13 feet wide. Now, so maybe your building code needs to allow you to actually break through some of those walls and make a house that somebody in the 21st century wants to live in. ecological designs, working with architects, working with landscape architects to get ecological ideas into the kinds of work that they propose. I think I'll show, did I have an example? I don't remember. Incentives, economic incentives to build and plan and design and operate sustainably. Baltimore has, I get it, I'm already in enough trouble, but so I don't care about getting into more. Baltimore has a toy light rail system, which goes from the suburbs to the Camden Yards and to the airport. They're now thinking about doing a cross line. All right, so I'm going to wrap up soon, aren't I? So here's an incentive to build that, an incentive to get people to start riding. That's an example of an incentive. And then watch out for the sustainability department. You know, you've got the traffic, you've got the sanitation, you've got the coroner, I looked up Louisville, where I grew up. It has about 48 municipal departments. Some of them are the old-fashioned engineering departments, and some of them are the Department of Sustainability. If you separate sustainability off into this thing that doesn't integrate with the other operations of the city government just to make you feel good, forget it. So you can, where do you live? What's your municipal structure look like? Does it help with these kind of things or not? Cities can do a lot of things. Each of these little lozenges has some of the things that cities can do. They can be industrial, they can shelter people in times of war or crisis, they can be sanitary, they can be defensive, that's how most of our cities started. They can be cities of consumption. This is what many of the cities in Africa are turning out to be, not cities of production. So how are these people being supported? Cities of innovation, we've talked about mercantile cities, finance, convenience, there are probably others. How do you get to this one? Out of all these possible things that cities can be, it's just something to be thought about. There are some places, there's some organizations that make serious efforts to try to show best practices. The Sustainable Sites Initiative is one. If you're planning a landscape, if you're doing a design that includes landscape architecture, this, for example, is a good place to go. These people have thought deeply about it. They're architects or landscape architects, but they sit elbow to elbow with ecologists, and so you're getting good advice from places like this. All right, so my 45 minutes is up, and I know, the human attention span is 20 minutes. So I've already taxed you. So what we've done is I tried to tell you a little bit of a story of Baltimore, the changes in Baltimore, not because they're unique, but in fact because they represent the kinds of changes that cities have gone through and will go through. And that last little list of lozenges suggests that there are many more kinds of transitions that are possible. How do we get to the ones in this moment of crisis that we want? I'm assuming that we want sustainable cities. For each place that we all represent, that's going to mean something slightly different. The social negotiation will be unique. And the strategy by which you achieve it or come closer to it will be contingent on the local realities. So by telling you some stories about what we've learned in Baltimore and how it's connected to the larger reality of urban areas, I hope I've given you something to think about and a way to see how you can be a part of sustainable cities wherever. All right, thanks. That's it.
Usual style, we'll have a question or two, some discussion here. Back here.
My question is, with a city complex like north central Jersey, Patterson, Passaic, Rutherford, that area went from very, very heavily industrialized to being literally a war zone. It was literally bombed out. How does that become sustainable?
Well, what one hopes for in situations like that, and that's a very common story in the United States, what one hopes for in situations like that is to find new kinds of activities that can reinvigorate those areas. And as an ecologist, the thing that I'm trying to do is to make sure as those plans are thought about, that people don't just sort of roll back over it and cover all the ecology back up. So that's my job. But how do you solve that problem? That's a big social problem. It's a big economic problem. It's a big problem of infrastructure that's been neglected or underused and not repaired. It's something equivalent to, it's a big job. It's something that's really worthy of coordinated state and national work. That's the only way that I can see how you would do that. Now, these days, we, of course, have to depend on public-private partnerships for that kind of thing because the government doesn't either have the resources or the will to marshal that kind of thing on its own. But I think that these are big problems. We need a Marshall Plan for the United States.
Here, Steve.
Is there any city that you would point to that you would say is the most sustainable?
That, there are lots of claims about that. And right now, you notice I didn't show you any pictures of sustainable cities. That was purposeful. There are cities that are working hard. I think that the Baltimore Sustainability Plan is a very, very well-done plan. It came from community action. It's not just so the mayor's saying this is what we'll do. So I think actually Baltimore is a nice example. Everybody knows Portland is a good green city, but that's almost too easy because you throw a seat down and it turns into an 80-foot tree in 3 months. That's a technical description. But Portland does have good things. One of the things that I didn't point out here is Baltimore County has an urban-rural demarcation line which was put in place in 1967, and it's so successful that more than 90% of the population of Baltimore County lives within that line. So I think Baltimore County deserves a lot more credit than it gets. I think that Chicago is doing really good work in integrating green space with the urban fabric, even though it has some of the Patterson-Passaic kind of issues. There are a lot of cities that are doing really cool things. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is doing good work. Again, integrating the green and gray infrastructures, getting people out of floodplains, as you can imagine, is a big problem in Pittsburgh. Using those areas to generate ecological work.
Other questions, comments? Yes, Sid.
What is the major driver of the sea change that you see coming? Is it academic innovation, creativity, community interest, political leadership? Where do you see the main drivers coming from?
That's a good question, and I'll be perfectly honest that as an ecologist, I haven't really thought much about that. I've just used it as a camel to ride. But I think it comes from a variety of sources. It comes from communities, local communities being frustrated that they can't get resources, so they have to take matters into their own hands and revitalize their own neighborhoods. And to have a rubric that they can share with other such communities seems to be really helpful. A lot of politicians realize that cities are in competition with each other, even though showing you these sort of smears, that cities are within those smears in competition with each other. And if cities can point to quality of life, concrete improvements in quality of life, that helps to bring in the creative classes. That's what the Bloomberg strategy has been in New York, and that's one of the. So,
Steward, you followed insight into what you guys are doing down in the Baltimore ecosystem study. That is so important to how we do ecosystem studies here. So many thanks.